Hello and welcome back to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, presented to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Happy Monday, everybody. Monday after draft day, got a lot of fallout. Got a good show to talk about, though. First, we're going to touch about the big surprise that happened. Shedeur Sanders falls all the way to not the second, not the third, not the fourth, but the fifth round, selected by the Cleveland Browns. Going to talk a little bit about that. Then we're going to talk a little bit about Shedeur even more. Going to talk about the prank calls that happened over the weekend and the fallout from that. Also going to touch a little bit about potential Super League incoming. Dabo Swinney seems to think it. We're going to talk about what the Clemson head coach said, get into some of that, what could potentially be happening in college football in the next 5-10 years. We're also going to talk about Quinn Ewers, his draft fall all the way to the 7th round. Should he have stayed at Texas? Possibly. Then make sure you stick around for my last segment. Going to go over some quarterback commitments, transfers, where they're landing, what the fit is like, and if it's a good move for them or not. But first, before I get into anything else, I just want to remind everyone that this show is all about you. We love hearing any comments, questions, insights you have. We want to make this show as interactive, as exciting, as fun as possible, and you are all a big part of that here at GSMC. We couldn't do what we do without your support. We're so grateful to have you as a part of our community. One great way to get involved, make sure your comment gets read on the air, is to use the Super Chat feature. To do that, you click the $ at the bottom of the chat box, type in your comment, question, opinion, hot take, whatever there. And this is a great way to ensure that your message is on the air, and also just a great way to support our channel, support what we're doing here at GSMC. We're so grateful to have all of you here with us as a part of the GSMC community. Now, I want to talk a little bit about, not that, I did not do my segments right now. I want to talk a little bit about Shedeur Sanders, about the fallout here, what's going on. And this was really interesting. This was a guy that at one point in the draft process was a projected top 2 or 3 pick. The Browns, Giants, both quarterback needy teams, needed a quarterback, but this is a guy that they passed on him in the first round. It was kind of surprising, though, that he lasted as long as he did throughout the day. One NFL wide receiver coach said that he's got a skill set, but no dominant trait. He called him a backup at this point and said that those guys kind of have to be wired for humble support of the starter. That's not what Shedeur Sanders is like. And then one of the knocks against his actual on-the-field skills is the sack number. Obviously, Colorado's line was a complete mess, complete disaster. He took like 90 sacks over the past 2 seasons. That's a lot of toll on your body. And it could also kind of show that maybe his processing isn't all the way there. He's also not super athletic. He can make plays. He can kind of extend a little bit, but he doesn't have that dominant athletic takeover ability. And also just arm strength overall. Just the overall strength of his arm isn't super great. Average at best, I would say. So those from the on-field perspective kind of were the knocks against Shedeur Sanders, right? But then there's also intel coming out. The same wide receiver coach said that he got intel from across the league, various sources, that Shedeur basically, the quote was, this guy has no awareness about how he's coming across. And then also, I think he said something about leverage. It seemed like Shedeur Sanders felt that he had a little more leverage about where he was going, where he was going to end up, than actually was the case in the NFL. And then also didn't help Shedeur Sanders' stock that he did not compete in the Senior Bowl or the NFL Scouting Combine. He didn't do either. He did do his pro day, but pro days are historically really scripted. They're really conducive to quarterback play. Will Howard had a great pro day at Ohio State, but that's a situation where you're at your pro day, you're throwing to your own wide receivers, you know what throws you're going to have to make. Pretty much every throw is scripted. So it's a much more controllable environment than the NFL Combine, than the Senior Day, Senior Bowl. And also, if you're not a first-round pick, if you're injured, it's going to create some pause, some concern. And a former NFL quarterbacks coach, he was quoted that he said it wasn't super surprising that Shedeur Sanders waited as long as he did in the draft. But now the draft process is over. Shedeur Sanders, 144th overall pick. That's set in stone. Nothing's going to change. We're not going back in time. And Shedeur Sanders is not going to be a first-round pick. He's a fifth-rounder. That's just how it shook out. And this is a guy that he was the most talked about player in this class by far. I think from a combo of things, also just the pedigree that comes with being Deion Sanders' son, the attention level. I think that's a big part of this. But this guy was the most talked about player in this class, I would say. And then this is a guy that probably has one of the most memorable draft falls in NFL history, if not the most. Obviously, hindsight's going to be 2020. We're not going to know how Shedeur Sanders, how his NFL's career is going to shake out. But when you compare this to other memorable draft slides, you think of Aaron Rodgers, who was a projected number one overall pick at one point, slid to the 20s. Brady Quinn was another guy that had a draft day slide. Obviously, Dan Marino in 83. That was a pretty infamous quarterback slide. But all those guys were first rounders. You had a little more recent ones. Will Levis, he was a second round pick, projected top 10 throughout the draft process. But you really haven't seen a guy that was a top 5 pick slide all the way to the 5th round. And again, Shedeur Sanders, he was never involved in off-field incidents. He didn't get in trouble. He never got arrested, nothing like that. But his character was constantly criticized and kind of attacked by various media outlets, various inside sources, quote unquote, and they cited a bunch of people that had been around this draft process that said, hey, this might not be super surprising if you actually see it. I talked a little bit about this last week on Friday, where The Athletic had surveyed 10 NFL coaches across the league and about whether they were surprised that Shedeur Sanders was not picked by the Steelers at 21. All 10 said no. So this was a thing that seems like the NFL was much lower on Shedeur Sanders than the media was. Anthony I said, I think the reason why Shedeur fell as far as he did is GMs and quarterback coaches don't want to be dealing. Yeah, I think that's a really big part of this. Everything that comes with Shedeur Sanders, it's a completely different package than really any quarterback prospect we've ever seen. You've seen guys like Eli Manning, obviously his dad was Archie Manning, had obviously had a great NFL career, but it's not Deion Sanders. Deion Sanders is one of the best all time. His presence throughout the media, just the personality, the everything that comes along with the Deion Sanders primetime experience. I agree. I don't think NFL coaches, GMs, really wanted to deal with that. But, at the same time, once he got to the 5th round, I think the value there was way too much for the Browns to pass up, even though they had taken a quarterback already in Dalen Gabriel with the 94th overall pick. But I think there is a little bit of bias here that has been kind of played into why Shedeur Sanders maybe fell. Because when you look at him from an on-field perspective as a quarterback prospect, this is a guy that even if he might not have been a first-round prospect on a lot of teams' draft boards, he was a for sure day 2 pick, second rounder, third rounder at minimum. He's still a guy that's extremely accurate. He completed about 70% of his passes. Mobile, he's got a high motor, seems to have a high character from everything that we've heard from Colorado, from that kind of perspective, from guys that have played with him. But I think, would it have made the NFL look bad if he didn't get drafted at all? Completely. It would have been a really black eye for the NFL. I think it would have been a really bad look. And at some point, he needed to be drafted. I think I would have been really, really surprised if he went undrafted. At some point, I think he was going to be drafted, but I think also the confidence that comes with Shedeur Sanders, he's very similar to Deion in that aspect where he's extremely confident in his abilities, declared himself the best quarterback in the class multiple times throughout the process. And I think that probably kind of rubbed some people the wrong way too. You don't really see that much. Obviously, you see guys, Cam Ward, confident player. I think Shedeur, in the way that he might have presented himself, especially it seems like his interviews at the Combine kind of rubbed some teams the wrong way. They said he came off brash, kind of arrogant. I think some of his answers might not have been what NFL teams wanted to hear. And I think, they didn't want to deal with the media that's going to come with Shedeur. And that's what it sounded like. It kind of sounded like he was arrogant, kind of standoffish in his interviews. I wonder if he was trying to tank interviews potentially to maybe get drafted by a certain organization or team. I'm not sure. That's kind of just a theory that maybe I have, but I don't know. It does kind of seem though like every time he met with teams, he rubs somebody the wrong way in that interview process. And it's just kind of interesting. This whole scenario, we have never really seen a guy fall this far before in the draft, I think. Obviously, you have had some guys, like I said, Aaron Rodgers, Dan Marino, but those guys were still first rounders. Will Levis more recently fell into the second, but not all the way to day 3. I think this had a lot more to do with off the field stuff, with teams maybe not wanting to have to do the whole Deion experience. That he's obviously going to be very vocal in Shedeur's career, what he has planned for his son, and he's going to be involved. The interview with Deion in the nightcap with Ocho Cinco, I kind of remember that. I don't remember all the details of that interview. I do remember, though, earlier in the process, there was a video that came out of Shedeur Sanders playing Madden, and he said that he only plays with the Browns. I thought that was kind of interesting because, maybe a little projection there. But this whole thing is going to be really interesting. I also think the fact that probably teams that were looking at him weren't looking at him as a day one starter right away. They were looking at him as more of a backup, developmental kind of quarterback. And if that's your situation, that's the scenario. This is a guy that has way too much media coverage and is just too much of a big name to kind of take over that role as a developmental backup guy. You're going to hear clamors for him to start. And I'm really curious to see how that quarterback competition is going to shake out in Cleveland. You have 4 quarterbacks on the roster now, traded for Kenny Pickett in the offseason. Brought in Flacco, obviously drafted Dylan Gabriel, and now you have Shedeur. So you got 4 guys. I'm not really sure who's actually going to start, who's going to win that competition. Do you think people took some of the comments he made on that podcast interview out of context? I'm sure. I mean, that happens all the time, where, you get a 5 or 10 second soundbite, and it sounds a lot worse just in that little chunk compared to maybe what Deion had said for that whole minute or minute and a half he was talking. People are always going to try to get hot takes, sound bites, and that's something that's going to come with the territory, especially when you have a guy like Deion Sanders, just the high profile. But yeah, I think this is probably more of NFL teams did not kind of want to have to deal with, everything that comes with Shedeur, the whole package, the whole production company, and just Deion as his father, the vocalness of Deion Sanders. He's obviously highly outspoken. Could that have rubbed teams the wrong way? And maybe coaches, GMs thought that was a sign that there could be further tension down the road, or arguments, discussions with Deion and Shedeur Sanders that these teams didn't want to have. I think that's very possible. I think especially if you look at Steelers, Pittsburgh, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I'm going to talk about Quinn Ewers later on in the show. I am kind of surprised he fell that far, but I do have another segment where I'm talking about Quinn Ewers. I kind of like the pickup for Miami. I think he's a better quarterback than he's getting credit for right now. Phillip Rivers is an interesting comp. I hadn't really thought of that, but I could kind of see that just in terms of play style. But we are going to take our first break of the show right now. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about the prank calls that happened over the weekend. Obviously, still going to touch on Shedeur here, but want to just talk about the prank calls overall. That's a really interesting scenario. But we're going to take our first break here on the GSMC College Football Podcast.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back to the GSMC College Football Podcast. Just talked a little bit about Shedeur Sanders' draft fall, kind of why that may have happened. Next, we're going to get into some prank calls. Then make sure you stick around. I'm going to do some quarterback commitments later on, touch on that in my last segment. But before I get into anything else, I just want to remind everyone that we love hearing from you during the show, whether it's a comment, question, opinion, insight, anything that you have. We'd love to hear this. We want to make this show as interactive, as exciting as possible. One good way to ensure that your comment gets on the air is to use the super chat feature. To do that, click the $sign in the bottom of the chat box to send in your comment, question, opinion there. It's a great way to support the show, support our channel. We can't do what we do at GSMC without your ongoing support. We're so grateful to have you here as a part of our community. So before I want to talk about the prank calls, Anthony said, I'm not sure if you agree with this. I think the reason why Mason Graham got drafted before Kenneth Grant. Yeah, I think that's definitely a big part of it. The one really big plus I have with Mason Graham is I think his floor is super high. At the absolute minimum, you're going to get a guy that has a really high motor that should be at least a decent starter in the NFL. If he doesn't have that kind of star power. But yeah, I think the floor-wise, I think it was kind of a safer pick for the Browns. Obviously, was a big position of need. I'm really high on Mason Graham. I think he can be a really good player in this league. But yeah, I think he was more pro-ready, just more solid overall as a prospect, more well-rounded. And I think he fit a little more schemes. He was a little more versatile, which I think that's also part of the reason that he may have gone a little earlier than Kenneth Grant did. Kenneth Grant, impressive D-tackle in his own right. But I think kind of the skill set of Mason Graham also, I think, like I said, that floor, just with his motor and his abilities already, I think he can come in right away and be a really solid contributor to an NFL team at the absolute minimum. And then obviously on the high end, could he be a Pro Bowler, All-Pro? I think he does have that potential. But I think why Mason Graham got drafted earlier, that mean streak, the motor, the higher floor, I think those were all kind of characteristics and part of the reason why that Mason Graham went earlier based on his tape, who was a comparison pro for Kenneth Grant of a current D-tackle. Tim Bowens, I could see that. This is a big D-tackle. I think also maybe somebody like a Vita Vea kind of, where you have a 330-pound guy that's plugging the holes in the middle and also kind of has a higher pass rush ability. I think that's a solid comp for him. But this is a guy that's a much different player than Mason Graham. Bigger overall. I think he's stronger in the run game, but I agree. I think he does have a little more pass potential. That's why I kind of think maybe a Vita Vea type where you're still 335 pounds, but you still have a little more pass rush ability. I think that might be kind of a solid comp for him. But I think he could be a really good player in the NFL too. I'm not super low on him. Casey Hampton, I could kind of see that too. But Kenneth Grant, I think, he might take a little more time to kind of develop before he reaches his potential. I think Mason Graham just was a little more pro-ready and just was able to kind of fit more scheme-wise. I think that's probably part of the reason why Mason Graham went a little earlier. And I also think Mason Graham probably has a little higher potential just on the high end of the projections. If everything kind of clicks for him, I think that's a guy that can be a top 5, top 3 D tackle in the NFL in the next 5-10 years. But we're going to have to wait and see. They're both really solid prospects. I think both can do a lot in the NFL right now. I want to switch gears a little bit. I want to talk kind of about the prank calls, what happened here. So obviously, 40th overall pick came around. The New Orleans Saints were on the board, and Shedeur Sanders gets a phone call, and the guy answers. He says, "Hey, this is Mickey Loomis here, GM of the Saints. It's been a long wait. We're going to take you with our next pick right here." And the best thing is this was all recorded, all taken down by Deion Sanders Jr.'s YouTube channel by Wall-Off Media. This was all on tape. And Shedeur, obviously, he's like, "Yes, sir, this is going to be legendary." And then the guy said, "But you're going to have to wait a little longer. Sorry about that." And hung up. Obviously, Shedeur Sanders was confused, kind of what happened. I think this is a bigger story. Be the D tackle. Chris Jones, are you talking about? Because Chris Jones, man, he's a baller. That's a guy that's a legit player. I could maybe see that. I think there's a lot that has to go right for Kenneth Grant to kind of reach that level. But it's definitely very possible. This is a guy that has a ton of potential, and especially if he gets in an NFL weight room, gets his body a little more right, I think that's a guy that could really blossom as an NFL pro for sure. But we're going to have to wait and see on that. I think that's going to be interesting, kind of how that all shakes out. But the prank calls, though, I think this was interesting. This happened not only to Shedeur Sanders, it sounds like Tyler Warren also got a prank call in the first round, as well as there was a 6th-round offensive lineman that got drafted by the Buffalo Bills, Chase Lunt. He said in his press conference he got 4 or 5 prank calls. And this is kind of interesting. You don't really see or hear about this a whole lot in the NFL draft, but the whole situation, apparently Jack Albrook, son of Jeff Albrook, Falcons defensive coordinator, was visiting his parents on a weekend home, found his dad's iPad, and it was open, unlocked, and was able to go into the context and find Shedeur Sanders' number and took it down there. I kind of feel for Jeff Albrook here. You know, it's a situation that you can't really control. You were at your own home, you had your iPad, and your son ended up taking it. Obviously, I mean, I'm about the same age as Jack Albrook. I know all of my parents' passwords. I could get into their iPad or whatever, and I think that's just kind of interesting. What the fallout's going to be here. Atlanta has said that Jeff Albrook is not going to be punished anymore. They said he wasn't aware of kind of what happened here, of the data breach, of the prank call, and I really think that is the case. Obviously, the NFL is going to investigate this and kind of what happened. But yeah, I think that Jack Albrook, this was really interesting. I don't know if he was responsible for all of these. There was one Falcons team official that said he was only responsible for the Shedeur Sanders phone call. I wonder kind of else what happened, if, the Tyler Warren call, if the Chase Lunt calls, were these from Jack Albrook's friends or just other people he knew, or were there other potential leaks throughout the NFL? That's going to be something that the NFL is going to investigate, kind of what happened here. But for Shedeur Sanders, he responded really well. I will give him this. He said he was on a conference call with some Cleveland area reporters after he was drafted. He said that he wasn't bothered by the prank. He said it didn't really have an impact on me because I was just like, I don't feed into negativity or I don't feed into that stuff. You've seen it on the YouTube channel. He said, it is what it is. I think, of course, it's childish. It was a childish act, but everybody does things. Everybody does childish things here and there. And props to Shedeur, honestly. I think that was a really great response. A diplomatic response, but the right move here. You accept that this happened, and obviously, after his fall, after kind of these reports that are coming out of him being brash, arrogant, kind of turning off NFL teams, I think this was the right move from his perspective to kind of switch gears, say, hey, this isn't a super big deal, even though that's something that, it could have ruined his draft night. That I'm sure from a prospect's point of view, you get a call like that and you think it's the call of a lifetime. Shedeur Sanders thought his slide was ending. He thought the Saints were going to pick him up here at 40. And they did actually take a quarterback. However, it was Tyler Shuck. It wasn't Shedeur Sanders. And I feel for the kid, honestly, there. That's got to be a really tough situation of you're fulfilling your lifelong goal of playing in the NFL, and you get a call, you think your dreams have come true, and it's not the case. It's someone just messing with you. The whole situation, I feel for Shedeur Sanders. I feel for these other prospects that this has happened to. I wonder what the NFL fallout is going to look like here, but we're going to see what happens. I don't know if this was just a Falcons leak or potentially others throughout the NFL. We're going to have to wait and see, though. So we're going to take our second break of the show. When we come back, we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about Dabo Swinney's comments and the potential of a Super League. Stick with us. We'll be back on the GSMC College Football Podcast.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back to the GSMC College Football Podcast. Just talked a little bit pretty much about Shedeur Sanders, his draft fall, kind of the prank phone calls as well. I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about what Dabo Swinney said of the potential of a college football super league. Dabo Swinney, the great resistor to college football change, now seems to believe that things are heading into what he said is probably the best era for college football. And he said that it seems like there could be a super league coming. This is something that has kind of been talked about for the last year or two. So last year, a formal proposal was endorsed, circulated by a group known as College Sports Tomorrow, and that included the presidents of Syracuse and West Virginia, among other kind of business sports industry leaders. They had a formal proposal for a super league, what that would kind of look like. And then also, right around the same time, this was about October 2024, Smash Capital, a venture capital firm, they privately pitched a bunch of universities on kind of injecting billions of dollars into the sport to create a single business plan, a single business organization that really just maintains college football's existing structure, kind of supervises it, and potentially shifts into more of a super league type. This has been something, though, that the Big Ten and SEC in particular have really spoken out against, especially in that kind of October 2024 time frame. Both of those conferences have had little interest in joining a plan like this because it honestly curtails their power, their influence in the decision-making process throughout college football. Obviously, those two conferences have really taken the forefront, have really stepped up and become almost a power two. There's been a growing disparity between those two and the Big 12 and ACC, so they kind of have the driver's seat right now, and Big Ten and SEC both don't really want to give up that power and control. According to the leagues, both of those leagues' latest tax returns, Big Ten dispersed around $16.5 million to each of its members, and the SEC gave out about $51 million a year to each of its member schools. And these payments are much more substantial than ACC Big 12 payouts. They're going to keep growing. The Big 10 is moving to 18 universities, 16 going to SEC up to 16. And Dabo Swinney kind of said the dominoes are already in place for a Super League to happen. He thinks it would probably include about 40 to 50 teams. And he was asked whether it would or should happen, and he responded with both. Dabo Swinney thinks it will happen, and he thinks it should happen. He was quoted, he said, "It's not sustainable the way we are, it's just a matter of time. It's one of those things, even though for some of us it's really clear to see, we just got to get through it to get there." And I honestly kind of agree with Dabo Swinney. I think the current structure of college football, the way conferences have been realigning, it's not sustainable for the future, especially when you have West Coast schools traveling all the way to the East Coast and vice versa throughout school weeks, especially if you're looking at sports besides college football, but even college football in general. You take a team that, say like a Penn State, that had to go to USC last year and play on Saturday. At a minimum, they're going to have to leave Friday, probably have to leave Thursday. And then you look at when Stanford and Cal had to go travel to their ACC games, their equipment buses would have to leave on like the Monday of that week before the game on Saturday just to get there in time to ensure that the team had all their equipment, everything they needed for the game. It's not sustainable right now. Another big domino just kind of fell into place for this potential restructuring is that Clemson, FSU have pretty much finalized their settlements with the ACC. Both schools had sued the ACC respectively, separately, over a couple of issues. The main issue was the league's grant of rights, and also the television viewership. That was a big issue here. The main argument was there's hundreds of millions of dollars in future TV rights. If a school left the ACC, would those rights belong to the ACC through the end of their TV deal, which is in 2036, or would they belong to the schools, to Florida State and Clemson, if they were to leave a little earlier? And then the other big thing was the exit fee. The ACC had a really substantial exit fee. It had been around up to $165 million, just not tenable for these schools. Couldn't be enforced, really. And so the total cost now is going to drop. It's still at $165 for 2026, but it's going to keep dropping annually according to these terms that they've kind of agreed upon. And reportedly, it levels out at $75 million in 2030, 2031, which is much more feasible for these universities to pay than $165 million. Instead of facing a $30 million annual gap in revenue, it should be around 15 as well, because the ACC has introduced a new revenue distribution model that's really placing an emphasis on TV ratings. So obviously Clemson, Florida State are two of the more recognizable brands in the ACC. They're going to drive more TV viewership, and they should have more revenue from that than some potential other ACC teams. But 2031 is the big year to circle here. That's because pretty much every major conference's TV deal ends between 2030 and 2034. if there's going to be any kind of major upheaval in college football, any major restructuring, I think that's kind of the timeline to look at is the next 5-6 years. What's going to happen in 2031? Because there's some TV deals that are going to end up. And they're going to need to renegotiate. The Big Ten, I think, ends in 2031. SEC's, again, right around there as well. But if there is going to be a Super League, I think that's probably going to be around the time it's going to happen. And honestly, it makes sense. So Dabo Swinney kind of envisioned the top 40 or 50 programs all joining forces, even the Big Ten and SEC, despite the fact that it would mean those two conferences probably ceding some revenue, ceding some power just in terms of decision-making. But he said eventually money's going to win the day. The other dynamics and factors will come into play. He said, I just think people are eventually going to see the business opportunity involved, and it's going to come down to brands and TV viewership and all that type of stuff. More so than a league. Eventually, that's where it'll get to. Who knows when we'll get there? Probably sooner rather than later. I think this is all pretty true. One thing I'm kind of curious to see about is how a potential Super League would determine who are those top 40 or 50 programs that get into this conference, this league. I think you're probably going to see the vast majority of SEC, Big Ten, ACC, Big 12 teams in, but where they draw that line in the sand, who they cut out, I think that's going to be kind of the interesting thing to see here. And then part of the reason that kind of Dabo Swinney sees this as inevitable is the current financial model. It's not working for enough schools. Some schools are just bleeding money, especially when you have the impending House settlement that's going to come in, where schools are going to be able to directly pay their student athletes. That's going to be a big thing here. That's a big cost for schools to cover. And when they're not making as much from TV revenue, it's going to be tougher for these programs and these universities to make those kind of decisions in terms of their athletics direction, just what's going to happen, where they allocate money to. And then also, just kind of like what I said, the scheduling. I think if you have a league that's a 40-50 program Super League, you can go back to maybe divisions, or you separate it more based on regions, and then you have a few crossover games. You have 2 or 3 games where teams might travel across the country, but you're not going to be doing it every other week. Cal, Stanford, they're not going to have to go to Maryland, or Virginia just every other week. That's not feasible. And the big thing here, too, is this still has to be college football based. This has to be a college thing. It can't end up being, an NFL kind of feeder league, G League type of sorts, a minor league system. It can't be that, because like Dabo Swinney said, he said that 98% of these kids aren't going to play football in the NFL. They're not getting to the pros. We need to help them maximize their opportunity here, and you need to equip them for life. And I completely agree with that. I think this is a big thing that we're going to see, is how much professionalization is going to be implemented in college football. I kind of like the idea of a Super League. I think the way conferences are going right now doesn't make a lot of sense. But if you have, say, a 50-league team, you split it up into 5 10-team divisions. You maybe go East Coast, Northeast, Midwest, Southeast, and a Pacific League, and then maybe like Texas kind of situation. I think that makes a lot of sense, where you break it up more regionally. You can kind of get back to some of these rivalries. You restore rivalries like Bedlam. You bring Oklahoma State, Oklahoma back. You bring back some of these rivalries that we've lost over the past couple years that are really great for college football. They're part of what makes the sport unique, part of what makes college football just its own thing. It's not the pros. There's a lot more loyalty tied to universities, fan bases. They're not going to disown their schools they went to or schools they grew up cheering for as fans. And I think Super League, it does make a lot of sense. When are we going to see it? I don't know. Will we see it? I don't know. I think 2030, though, 2031, we could see some really big changes in the college football landscape, in how it's structured, and where players go, where teams go, where these universities end up being. I think that's going to be really interesting. And also what's going to happen to some of these smaller programs if they're not in the Super League. We're going to have to find out. We're going to see where college football goes. But don't be surprised. Could a Super League be coming? I think it might at some point. So we're going to take another short break on the show right now. When we come back, I want to talk a little bit more about the draft, but I want to talk about Quinn Ewers and his draft day, his decision, kind of what happened there. Was it the right move or not? But we'll be back shortly on the GSMC College Football Podcast.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back to the GSMC College Football Podcast, presented to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. We've had a decent show already, I think. I don't know. That's my opinion. But talked a little bit about Shedeur Sanders. Talked a little bit about the potential Super League. I want to switch gears and talk about Quinn Ewers and kind of what happened on draft weekend with Quinn Ewers. So, obviously, projected to be a middle round pick. Some people had as high as a second or third round grade on him. Probably was realistically going to be maybe a fourth or fifth rounder, but did not happen. Quinn Ewers fell to the 7th round, was drafted by the Miami Dolphins, and this is just a really interesting scenario, I think, overall. Quinn Ewers, this was a kid that was the highest ranked high school quarterback prospect ever by internet recruiting sites. Certain sites had literally a perfect grade on him. He was a 100 overall prospect. I think that also kind of set the expectations for him for his college football career. And this was a guy that I think if he didn't have those expectations, I think his career would have been looked at in a much better light. He really did have a solid college career. Twice made second team all-conference, led Texas kind of back. You know, there was always the meme of Texas is back. But Quinn Ewers really did bring Texas back. They came back. They're now still a college football playoff contender, perennial. I think they're back in that really big blue blood kind of state mindset. And I think a lot of that was because of Quinn Ewers and what he brought to Texas. And this was a guy that he was a number 1 ranked quarterback in that 2021 recruiting class. And you look at some of the other names in that class. Caleb Williams was the 2nd overall quarterback. Drake May, number 4. J.J. McCarthy, number 6. Jackson Dart, 13. Garrett Nussmeier, who could be a first-round quarterback next year, had 4,000 yards last season for LSU. He was the 19th quarterback in the class. Shedeur Sanders was number 37. Riley Leonard was number 58 in this class. This was a guy that Quinn Ewers was ranked higher than all of them. Scouts, pundits, they all thought that this guy was going to be the best quarterback of this class. And I think that kind of shows his overall talent level, what he's capable of. I'm really curious on, was this the right decision for Quinn Ewers? He probably, if he entered the transfer portal, I think he could have made at least $4 million. You know, you had a guy like Carson Beck, who's coming off a shoulder injury, who's probably a little more highly graded as a quarterback prospect, but he got over $3 million from Miami. I think Quinn Ewers was probably going to get a little bit more than that, just because of his winning ability, what he brings to a table as a veteran quarterback. I think he probably could have made about $3-4 million. Now, you look at what he's going to get from Miami Dolphins on a 7th round rookie deal. Financially wise, obviously, it seems like if he had stayed at Texas for another year, or not at Texas, just stayed in college for another year, Quinn Ewers probably could have made a little more money this next season. But here's the other thing. I think he definitely would have had to enter the transfer portal. There was no way that Texas was not going to let Arch Manning start this year. This was the year for Arch to take over. Obviously, we've been seeing the grooming of Arch Manning the past couple seasons, saw him play even more this past year, and everything that sounds like coming out of Austin, they want Arch Manning to be that quarterback one for the Longhorns. And I think Quinn Ewers, he was going to be shown the door, even if he wasn't. If he decided to stay in college, he was going to be shown the door. But I think he would have made a lot more money if he stayed in college. So was that the right decision? I'm not sure. He didn't make the decision based on financials, which is funny because you look at the start of his college career. He reclassed, enrolled early at Ohio State to get a 7-figure NIL deal. Got about $1 million, 1.4, I believe, in that initial deal as like a 17-year-old. And then he never really had a chance to win the Ohio State job. Spent the season there, got his paycheck, then transferred back to Texas. But this is also a guy that, if you look at his NFL draft stock, he suffered injuries in all 3 years at Texas. Deep ball accuracy left a lot to be desired at times. And also just his pocket awareness overall was a little questionable. So those are kind of some of the knocks on Quinn Ewers as a prospect. But there's still a lot of good things about his game. His arm strength, he's got a really quick release. He's got nice touch on the balls. He's a tough quarterback. He's got a lot of poise in the pocket. I thought somebody would probably take a flyer on him a little earlier. I had him ranked much higher in my overall quarterbacks on this class. But this is also a guy that I think if he did stay in college, he would have had to leave. I'm not sure if he really wanted to go anywhere else. He was a guy that grew up rooting for Texas, was a big fan of them, always wanted to be the Texas starting quarterback. He fulfilled that dream. He led them to a college football playoff, and also made a bunch of money during his time at Texas. Had NIL deals he had a national Dr. Pepper commercial, was on the cover of College Football 25, had a New Era deal, had a Lucchese deal, even had a private jet company deal. And then he was also paid in NIL money from the Texas actual collective. So I'm sure Quinn Ewers did pretty well for himself over his few years at Texas. I wonder if it was the right call. The one thing, too, is I don't think his stock was going to get any higher in next year's draft class. This is a much weaker quarterback class overall. And if he was a 7th rounder in this class, he could have been a UDFA next year and been fighting for a roster spot. So from that perspective, I think it might have made more sense for him to go to the NFL right away. But from a financial-based point of view, it was a little questionable that Quinn Ewers kind of did this. And I wonder if we're going to start seeing this more in college football. Will guys want to stay and try to rack up some NIL money if they're going to be a 3rd or 4th round pick? If they know that rookie deal isn't going to be as much as they're making in college right now, are we going to see more players decide to skip the draft, forego early eligibility, and stay in college for another year or two? I think that's going to be something we're going to have to wait and see. I think it's very possible, though. You saw Cam Ward do it last season. He could have gone in the draft after the Washington State year, decided to transfer to Miami, and obviously that was a great decision for him. He was probably going to be a day 2 quarterback last year, ended up being the 1st overall pick this season. Carson Beck, another guy that we saw this, he could have gone this year, decided to transfer, go to Miami as well. We're going to have to wait and see where his draft stock is next season. But from a financial point of view, obviously he helped his situation overall. I think, though, Quinn Ewers, I don't think he wanted to have to transfer to a new team. He was going to have to learn a whole new offense, work with new wide receivers, and I don't think that's something he wanted to do. But I'm curious on whether this is actually going to be a trend that we continue to see throughout college football. are these guys foregoing early eligibility to stick around and maybe try to rack up a little bit more financially than they probably will as mid-round picks in the NFL? Quinn Ewers is going to be one of the big cases here. I think a really big thing for him was just the durability issues, right? He got hurt every year as a starter, different injuries, had an AC joint sprain at one point, but this is a guy that really got roughed up a little bit at Texas. If he really truly believed, got intel that he was a day 2, early day 3 pick in January, it made a lot of sense for him to come out. It was a safer bet than trying to stay in college, and especially when you look at that quarterback class. I think, though, probably realistically, this was a move that Quinn Ewers could have gone either way on. I don't think his draft stock was getting any higher. I like the landing spot in Miami for him, honestly. He can sit behind Tua. Obviously, Tua has had injury concerns of his own throughout the years. Concussions are the big question mark for Tua Tagovailoa. I think this could be a guy that could get looks next season, potentially, or this year if Tua's hurt. I think he'll be in contention for the backup role. If not, will be a third string or a practice squad guy. I think, though, Quinn Ewers potentially could get some looks as a part-time starter for Miami at some point if Tua gets hurt again, if he's struggling. We'll see. I like the landing spot, though. I think Mike McDaniel can use Quinn Ewers, can utilize his skill set, what he does well to maximize his potential in the NFL. But was it the right call for him to stay or to go? Not really sure. I don't think his stock was getting any higher. I think he probably would have been a UDFA next year, just looking at his stock and where he ended up being drafted this season. But, hindsight, we'll never know. Now, I want to take another short break here on the show. When we come back, going to talk a little bit about some of the quarterback commitments from transfers as well as a high school pickup that occurred this weekend. But we're going to take a short break, and we'll be back on the GSMC College Football Podcast. Welcome back to the GSMC College Football Podcast. I had a big draft show, but going to switch gears a little bit, talk about some of the quarterbacks that have committed in the transfer portal, as well as a big pickup for the Michigan Wolverines. First guy, though, Jaden Rashada, the former one-time Florida commit, then Arizona State guy, then Georgia guy, is now going to Sacramento State. He announced this on Friday. Still has his whole lawsuit against Florida and Billy Napier right now over his NIL deal that fell apart when he was a high school recruit. But this is a move that is going to create some buzz at Sacramento State. Obviously, Sac State is trying to level up. They are applying to become an FBS independent, move up from the FCS. I think they're probably going to try to position themselves to join a conference in the near future once they're at the FBS level. But this is a move. This is a big-time pickup for Sac State. But I think this was a guy that was the 84 overall recruit in the 2023 class. Sac State hired former UNLV offensive coordinator Brennan Marion as their head coach in December. And this was a guy that created his own offense, really. Pioneer of, it's called the go-go offense. And essentially, the go-go offense kind of creates a triple option scenario at every snap, basically. They put two running backs in the backfield. There's a lot of movement and shifting with those running backs. Both running backs can get the ball in the backfield. The quarterback can run. Quarterback can pass as well. So it kind of really stretches the defense, really forces them to key in on certain guys to make decisions at a certain point in time. I think it's an offense that kind of fits Jaden Rashada, and Sacramento State is obviously trying to level up in football. They had a rough year last year, only won, I believe, 3 games. And it's going to be a big adjustment period for Sac State, but I think the talent pedigree, recruiting pedigree of Jalen Rashada kind of gives them a higher ceiling than potentially thought of. And this is a really unique offense that I think he fits well. He's got a dual threat ability. If Sac State has 2 running backs they like, this is an innovative look. The Patriots actually kind of used it when Cam Newton was the quarterback there, kind of built their offense around him. And this was a guy that also, Brennan Marion, he had Gus Malzahn to learn from. He went to Tulsa 2007, 2008, broke a bunch of records as a wide receiver there. And that was where Gus Malzahn was the offensive coordinator during that time frame. So has a little influence from kind of that Gus Malzahn 2010s Auburn offense. I think, though, this is a move that makes a lot of sense for both program and player. Jaden Rashada probably needed to step down in terms of competition after not seeing the field at all at Georgia last season. Started a few games at Arizona State in 2023, but did end up losing out to Sam Levitt there. So this is a guy that he needed a landing spot that makes sense. Sac State gives him a spot where he can start and where the pressure isn't super high, at least right now. Can be a guy that can kind of grow into that role and be a decent starter for Sac State, has the potential to be a more high-level starter. I think that's kind of going to be an interesting move there of what happens with Jaden Rashada. I also think Steve Angeli going to Syracuse, officially announced. This is a move that I really liked. Angeli hit the portal about 10 days ago, and Syracuse was looking for a new starter. They didn't really have a ton of depth in that quarterback room. Added LSU transfer Ricky Collins, who appeared in 4 games last season with the Tigers. Has only played, though, 33 career snaps, so a guy that doesn't really have a ton of experience. And he's the only quarterback on Syracuse roster that had any type of game experience before the addition of Steve Angeli. This was a team that was looking to replace Ohio State transfer Kyle McCord, who led the FBS in passing yards last season, led the Orange to a really surprising 10-3 season. Head coach Fran Brown, who was the Clemson defensive backs coach, has really kind of highlighted, upgraded the Syracuse football program. And I think Steve Angeli makes a lot of sense as a guy that could be a 1 or 2 year bridge starter for Syracuse. Doesn't also have a ton of experience. He's only started 1 game ever. That was the Sun Bowl against Oregon State in 2023. Had a decent game. Went 15 of 19, 232 yards, a couple touchdowns in that game. Also was forced into action in the College Football Playoff semifinal against Penn State. In his 1 drive, he went 6 for 7, 44 yards, but did take a sack at the end, and Notre Dame had to settle for a field goal. However, he did drive him down the field. This is a guy that I don't know if he has the highest ceiling, but at the very minimum has a really solid floor as a guy that won't turn the ball over, is going to be solid, steady quarterback. You probably won't see a ton of exciting quarterback play from Steve Angeli, but a guy that I think can be a really decent starter at a Power 4 program. And Syracuse is a really good fit for him. They didn't have a ton of experience. Obviously, Angeli has only played a couple games over his career, but a guy that's a 3-year backup, backed up Riley Leonard, backed up Sam Hartman before. So a guy that still has a little more seniority than anybody else in that Syracuse quarterback room. I think it's a move that makes a lot of sense, and at the minimum it kind of adds more to that quarterback competition. Steve Angeli might not win out. It could still be Ricky Collins, who seemed to be in the leader house for Syracuse. But I think at the very minimum, Steve Angeli gives them a really high-level backup if they do decide to go Ricky Collins week 1. And on the high end, Steve Angeli gives Syracuse a guy that can start and be a decent starter for them as they try to replicate some of that 2024 success. Another quarterback that transferred, and he announced he is committed to Tulane, is former Iowa Northwestern quarterback Brendan Sullivan. Tulane actually took in 2 quarterback transfers in the winter portal, brought in Caden Simonza from Ball State, also brought in TJ Finley from pick one of the 4 schools that he attended before. Because they lost Darian Mensah, he transferred to Duke and got a really big deal to go to Duke. This was a team that needed a couple different options, and especially after TJ Finley's arrest for a stolen truck, that was a really interesting scenario there too. TJ Finley was suspended after that. He's now in the portal again. So Tulane needed a guy with starting experience, and Sullivan has that. He's started 11 Big Ten games over the past 3 years, started, I believe, 3 games last season for Iowa, and was still on that roster, but Iowa brought in South Dakota State transfer Mark Gronowski, who had a really storied career for the Jackrabbits there. And so I think Brendan Sullivan kind of saw the writing on the wall, but this is a good move for him, good landing spot. Tulane needed a guy to kind of come in and start after losing Darian Mensah and losing TJ Finley, and I think it gives Tulane a guy with starting level experience, and just veteran leadership overall. The last guy I want to talk about, though, I think this is a really interesting one. So, 4-star quarterback, 2026 quarterback Brady Smeagol has committed to the Michigan Wolverines. ESPN's number 4 pocket passer in the 2026 class. This is a kid that's 6'5", 210, from California, actually, so Michigan kind of reaching out across the nation. Number 45 overall recruit, and began the weekend as the cycle's number 2 available quarterback in this class. Was a former Florida State commit, kind of decommitted after that 2-10 season, after they hired Gus Malzahn, changed their offense a little bit. He really noted his connection with Michigan offensive coordinator Chip Lindsey, who had previously recruited him at North Carolina. And this is going to be a guy that the program tradition and also the opportunity to step in to their room behind Bryce Underwood, I think, were both appealing for Brady Smeagol. He shut down his recruitment at one point, and this is a guy that's got really standout arm strength, elite downfield accuracy, one of the better quarterback prospects in this 2026 class. Has been a 3-year starter as a quarterback, enter his senior season with over 11,000 career passing yards, 147 passing touchdowns throughout those 3 years. So this is a guy that's been super productive. Last season as a junior, threw for 3,500 yards, had 49 passing touchdowns, and led his school, Newberry Park, to a division title. This is a guy that's going to be a really great pickup for Michigan. At a minimum, he adds to that Michigan quarterback room, gives them more depth, gives them a really high-end option behind Bryce Underwood. Obviously, this is Bryce Underwood's team in the future, but the addition of Brady Smeagol gives them a really high-quality backup and a guy that could potentially take over for Bryce Underwood after his couple years as a starter there. But I really like this move from Michigan. It's just adds depth to that room. This was a quarterback room that was in complete shambles in 2024, and in just the span of one season, they're in much better shape for the future of that quarterback room at Michigan. Immediately upgrades their floor and their ceiling at the position and as a team overall. I really like the move, and we're going to see kind of what happens with Brady Smeagol there. This is going to be Bryce Underwood's show, but at a minimum, gives them a really great depth option, a development option behind him going into 2026 and beyond. So that's going to be all for our show today. Thank you so much for tuning into the GSMC College Football Podcast presented to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Please remember to subscribe, like, follow, share, all of that fun stuff. And if you want, you can also go to Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok for more sports content, more sports updates that you love. Thank you so much, and have a great day.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great.